In 1979, inside the high-security walls of the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, an inmate named Barry Mills brutally attacked a fellow prisoner named John Marsloff over an unpaid gambling debt, nearly decapitating him in the process. At the time, Mills was already serving a sentence for armed robbery. But rather than spending the rest of his days isolated, Mills found a new sense of purpose within the walls of the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, where he became deeply involved with the Aryan Brotherhood. This notorious white supremacist prison gang, also known as the Brand, had been formed in the 1960s at San Quentin State Prison in California, and its influence was rapidly spreading throughout the U.S. prison system. The Aryan Brotherhood's roots were firmly planted in the racial tensions of the time, as prisons began to desegregate and inmates organized themselves into gangs along racial lines. But that wasn't the strangest part. The Aryan Brotherhood had also been inspired by the Bluebird Gang, and had even attempted to form an alliance with Charles Manson and the Manson family. Although this relationship was short-lived due to the Aryan Brotherhood's distaste for the brutal murder of pregnant actress Sharon Tate. As Mills rose through the ranks of the Aryan Brotherhood, he became known for his ruthless tactics and his ability to consolidate power within the organization. In 1980, he assumed a seat on the gang's 3-member federal commission, alongside other high-ranking members such as Tyler Bingham. Together, they expanded the Aryan Brotherhood's operations into federal and state prisons and began to focus on more lucrative activities such as narcotics dealing and racketeering. But the Aryan Brotherhood's growth was not without its challenges. The gang faced opposition from other prison gangs, including the Black Guerrilla Family and La Nostra Familia, and was forced to engage in a series of brutal race wars in order to maintain its dominance. One of the most notorious incidents involving the Aryan Brotherhood during this time was the murder of Robert Chappell, a black inmate who was strangled to death by Thomas Silverstein and Clayton Fountain in 1981. The two men were later convicted of the crime, and Silverstein went on to commit further atrocities, including the murder of a correctional officer and a fellow inmate. But the Aryan Brotherhood's violence was not limited to its dealings with other inmates. The gang also targeted correctional officers, and in 1983, 2 officers were killed in a brutal attack at the United States Penitentiary in Marion. The incident was a stark reminder of the Aryan Brotherhood's power and influence within the prison system, and it marked a turning point in the gang's history, as it began to attract more attention from law enforcement and the media. As the Aryan Brotherhood continued to grow and expand its operations, it also began to attract new members, including a group of Texas inmates who would eventually form the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, a separate and distinct organization that would go on to become one of the most violent and notorious prison gangs in the United States. But that's a story for another time for now. It's worth noting that the Aryan Brotherhood's influence extended far beyond the walls of the prison, and that its activities had a profound impact on the wider community. The gang's involvement in narcotics dealing and racketeering, for example, helped to fuel the growth of organized crime in the United States, and its violent tactics inspired a new generation of white supremacist groups and individuals. Despite the many challenges it faced, the Aryan Brotherhood continued to thrive, and by the 1990s, it had become one of the most powerful and feared prison gangs in the United States. Barry Mills, now a high-ranking member of the gang, was at the forefront of this expansion, and his influence extended far beyond the walls of the prison. In 1996, he proposed that the Aryan Brotherhood absorb the prison gang known as the Dirty White Boys, and in 1997, he ordered his members to carry out a race war against a rival prison gang, the D.C. Blacks. The incident marked a new low point in the Aryan Brotherhood's history, and it would ultimately lead to the downfall of Mills and several other high-ranking members of the gang. But the Aryan Brotherhood story is complex and multifaceted, and it's worth noting that the gang's activities were not limited to violence and crime. Many of its members were also involved in more mundane activities, such as smuggling contraband and extorting money from other inmates. And while the gang's ideology was rooted in white supremacy, it's also worth noting that many of its members were motivated by more practical concerns, such as survival and self-protection. The Aryan Brotherhood was, after all, a product of the prison system, and its activities were shaped by the harsh realities of life behind bars. As the years went by, the Aryan Brotherhood continued to evolve and adapt, and its influence extended far beyond the walls of the prison. The gang's activities had a profound impact on the wider community, and its ideology inspired a new generation of white supremacist groups and individuals. But the Aryan Brotherhood story is also one of tragedy and loss, and it's worth noting that many of its members paid a heavy price for their involvement with the gang. Barry Mills, for example, spent decades behind bars and ultimately died in prison in 2018 at the age of 70. His legacy is complex and multifaceted, and it's a reminder that the Aryan Brotherhood story is one that is both fascinating and disturbing. But that's a story for another time. For now, it's worth noting that the Aryan Brotherhood's influence continues to be felt, and that its activities remain a major concern for law enforcement and the wider community. As the Aryan Brotherhood continued to expand its reach, both inside and outside of prison walls, its leadership structure became increasingly complex. At the helm of the organization was Barry Mills, a man known for his ruthless tactics and calculating demeanor. Mills, also known as the Baron, had risen through the ranks of the Aryan Brotherhood during the 1970s and 80s, earning a reputation as a cunning and formidable leader. But despite his formidable reputation, Mills' own history was marked by violence and brutality, including a conviction for nearly beheading another inmate over a gambling debt. This incident, which occurred in 1979, would prove to be just one of many violent episodes that would define Mills' tenure as leader of the Aryan Brotherhood. As the Aryan Brotherhood grew in power and influence, it began to attract attention from law enforcement and other prison gangs. One of the most notable rivalries was with the D.C. Blacks, a prison gang that had been formed in the 1970s. The conflict between the two gangs would eventually escalate into a full-blown race war, with the Aryan Brotherhood emerging as one of the dominant forces. But the war with the D.C. Blacks was just one of many battles that the Aryan Brotherhood would fight, both inside and outside of prison. The gang's involvement in narcotics dealing and racketeering had also drawn the attention of federal authorities, who were determined to take down the organization's leadership. And so, in 2006, a federal indictment was handed down, charging Mills and several other high-ranking members of the Aryan Brotherhood with a range of crimes, including murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. The indictment was the result of a lengthy investigation, one that had been years in the making. Federal prosecutors had been gathering evidence against the Aryan Brotherhood for decades, and they finally had enough to bring the gang's leaders to justice. The trial was a major media event, with many of the nation's top newspapers and television networks covering the proceedings. And as the evidence against Mills and his co-defendants mounted, it became clear that the Aryan Brotherhood's days as a major force in the prison gang world were numbered. But even as the gang's leadership was being dismantled, its influence continued to be felt. The Aryan Brotherhood had spawned a number of splinter groups, including the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, which would go on to become one of the most violent and notorious prison gangs in the country. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, or ABT, had been formed in the 1980s, after a group of Texas inmates had been denied permission to start a chapter of the original Aryan Brotherhood. Undeterred, the inmates had gone ahead and formed their own gang, which would eventually become one of the most feared and respected in the Texas prison system. The ABT's early years were marked by violence and bloodshed, as the gang fought to establish itself as a major player in the prison gang world. And as the gang's reputation grew, so did its membership, with many young inmates seeking to join the ABT's ranks. But the gang's violent tactics and racist ideology would eventually attract the attention of law enforcement, who would launch a series of investigations and crackdowns aimed at dismantling the ABT's leadership. One of the most notorious incidents involving the ABT occurred in 1985, when a prospect named Virgil Barfield was ordered to kill a fellow inmate named Calvin Massey. The incident was caught on camera, and the video footage would later be used as evidence in Barfield's trial. The killing was just one of many violent episodes that would define the ABT's early years, and it would set the tone for the gang's future activities. But despite the ABT's reputation for violence, the gang's leadership was not without its challenges. The ABT was constantly at war with other prison gangs, including the Mandingo Warriors and the Aryan Circle, and the gang's members were often targeted by law enforcement. And yet, despite these challenges, the ABT continued to grow and thrive, becoming one of the most powerful and feared prison gangs in the country. As the Aryan Brotherhood and its splinter groups continued to evolve and expand, their influence began to extend beyond the prison walls. The gang's involvement in narcotics dealing and racketeering had made them major players in the organized crime world, and their violent tactics had earned them a reputation as ruthless and feared. But the gang's impact went beyond the world of crime, with their racist ideology and violent tactics also contributing to a broader climate of fear and intimidation. And as the gang's influence continued to grow, it became clear that their activities would have far-reaching consequences, not just for the prison system, but for society as a whole. The Aryan Brotherhood's legacy would be one of violence, racism, and intimidation, and its impact would be felt for generations to come. But that wasn't the only legacy that the Aryan Brotherhood would leave behind. The gang's activities had also sparked a series of investigations and crackdowns, as law enforcement sought to dismantle the gang's leadership and disrupt its operations. And as the investigations continued, it became clear that the Aryan Brotherhood's reach extended far beyond the prison walls, with ties to other organized crime groups and even to some members of law enforcement. The gang's involvement in corruption and bribery had allowed it to operate with relative impunity, and it had even managed to infiltrate some of the highest levels of the prison system. But as the truth about the Aryan Brotherhood's activities began to emerge, it became clear that the gang's days as a major force in the prison gang world were numbered. The Aryan Brotherhood's downfall would be a long and complex process, involving the efforts of law enforcement, prison officials, and even some former members of the gang. And as the gang's leadership was dismantled, its membership would begin to dwindle, with many former members seeking to distance themselves from the gang's violent and racist ideology. But even as the Aryan Brotherhood's influence began to wane, its legacy would continue to be felt, a reminder of the dangers of racism, violence, and intimidation. The gang's story would serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of addressing the root causes of violence and racism, and of working to create a more just and equitable society. And as the Aryan Brotherhood's history was written, it would become clear that the gang's impact had been far-reaching, with consequences that would be felt for generations to come. As the years passed, the Aryan Brotherhood's influence would continue to decline, with many of its former members either in prison or dead. But the gang's legacy would live on, a reminder of the dangers of racism and violence. And as the nation struggled to come to terms with its own complex and often fraught history, the Aryan Brotherhood story would serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of addressing the root causes of violence and racism. The gang's history would be a complex and multifaceted one, full of twists and turns, and marked by both violence and tragedy. But it would also be a reminder of the importance of hope and resilience, and of the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most daunting challenges. And as the Aryan Brotherhood story was told and retold, it would become clear that the gang's legacy would be one of both darkness and light, a reminder of the dangers of racism and violence, but also of the importance of forgiveness, redemption, and the human capacity for change. Behind the concrete walls of maximum security facilities, the gang's ambitions soon expanded far beyond the borders of California's state prisons. By the late 1970s, the federal prison system was witnessing a coordinated shift in power, orchestrated by inmate leaders who saw state lines not as boundaries, but as potential territories. Chief among them was Barry Byron Mills, a Windsor. As Barry Byron Mills rose through the ranks of the Aryan Brotherhood, his influence extended beyond the confines of California's state prisons. By the late 1970s, Mills had become a key figure in the gang's expansion into the federal prison system, where he would eventually assume a seat on the 3-member federal commission that governed the organization. But Mills' ascent was not without its challenges. In 1979, he was convicted of nearly beheading another inmate, John Marsloff, over a gambling debt at USB Atlanta, a brutal act that would earn him a reputation as a ruthless and cunning leader. But that wasn't the strangest part. Despite his violent tendencies, Mills was also known for his charisma and strategic thinking, qualities that would serve him well as he navigated the complex web of alliances and rivalries within the prison gang world. As the Aryan Brotherhood continued to grow and expand, Mills played a key role in consolidating the gang's power structure, working closely with other high-ranking members like Tyler Bingham to establish a robust and efficient organizational framework. This framework would enable the gang to engage in a range of lucrative activities, from narcotics dealing to racketeering, and would ultimately cement the Aryan Brotherhood's position as one of the most powerful and feared prison gangs in the United States. However, Mills' ambitions would eventually lead him to clash with other gangs and prison authorities. In the 1990s, the Aryan Brotherhood became embroiled in a series of violent conflicts with rival gangs, including the D.C. Blacks, a conflict that would ultimately lead to the deaths of several inmates and the imposition of severe penalties on Mills and other high-ranking members of the gang. In 1997, Mills and Bingham reportedly ordered their members to carry out a race war against the D.C. Blacks, a move that would have devastating consequences for all parties involved. The violence would eventually subside, but not before the Aryan Brotherhood had emerged as one of the most dominant and feared gangs in the federal prison system. As the years passed, Mills would continue to play a key role in the Aryan Brotherhood, even as the gang faced increasing pressure from law enforcement and other external threats. In 1996, he proposed that the gang absorb the prison gang known as the Dirty White Boys, a move that would have significant implications for the gang's internal dynamics and its relationships with other prison gangs. But despite these challenges, Mills remained a powerful and influential figure within the Aryan Brotherhood, a testament to his cunning, charisma, and unwavering commitment to the gang's ideology and goals. But Mills' grip on power would eventually begin to slip. In 2006, he and several other high-ranking members of the gang were indicted on a range of charges, including murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. The indictment would mark the beginning of the end for Mills, who would eventually be convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he sat in his cell at ADX Florence, a maximum security prison in Colorado, Mills must have reflected on the choices he had made and the consequences that had followed. The Aryan Brotherhood, once a powerful and feared gang, was now facing unprecedented challenges and pressures, and it was unclear whether it would be able to survive and thrive in a rapidly changing prison landscape. As the Aryan Brotherhood struggled to adapt to the new realities of the prison system, Mills' legacy would continue to shape the gang's trajectory. His commitment to the gang's ideology and his willingness to do whatever it took to achieve its goals had inspired a generation of inmates, but they had also contributed to the gang's reputation for violence and brutality. As the years passed, the Aryan Brotherhood would continue to evolve and change, but it would never shake off the shadow of Mills' leadership, a reminder of the enduring power and influence of one of the most notorious prison gangs in American history. But that's not the end of the story, as the Aryan Brotherhood's impact would be felt far beyond the prison walls, and its legacy would continue to shape the lives of those who had been touched by its violence and ideology. As the Aryan Brotherhood's influence spread beyond the prison walls, its members began to exert control over various aspects of the criminal underworld. They established a network of operatives who worked to expand their reach, often through violent means. One notable example is the case of Barry Mills, also known as the Baron, who rose to prominence within the Aryan Brotherhood during the 1970s and 80s. Mills' leadership played a significant role in consolidating the gang's power structure, and he was instrumental in expanding their operations into federal and state prisons. But Mills' ascent was not without its challenges. In 1979, he was convicted of nearly beheading another inmate, John Marsloff, over a gambling debt at USB Atlanta. This incident highlighted the brutal nature of the Aryan Brotherhood's internal conflicts and the willingness of its members to use violence to settle disputes. Despite this, Mills continued to climb the ranks, and by 1980, he had assumed a seat on the gang's three-member federal commission. Along with Tyler Bingham, he worked to expand the Aryan Brotherhood's operations, moving the group into narcotics dealing and racketeering. The Aryan Brotherhood's expansion into new areas of criminal activity was marked by increased violence and brutality. In 1996, Mills proposed that the gang absorb the prison gang known as the Dirty White Boys, a move that would further solidify their power and influence. The following year, he and Bingham reportedly ordered their members to carry out a race war against a rival prison gang, the D.C. Blacks. This conflict would result in numerous murders and violent clashes, cementing the Aryan Brotherhood's reputation as one of the most feared and ruthless prison gangs in the United States. But the Aryan Brotherhood's violent antics would eventually catch up with them. In 2006, Mills, Bingham, and several other high-ranking members were indicted for numerous crimes, including murder, conspiracy, drug trafficking, and racketeering. The indictment was the result of a lengthy investigation, and it marked a significant turning point in the government's efforts to dismantle the Aryan Brotherhood's leadership. Mills and Bingham were ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentences were imposed in 2007, and they would spend the remainder of their lives behind bars. The Aryan Brotherhood's decline was further accelerated by the conviction of other high-ranking members. Edgar Hevell, a fellow member, was also convicted of committing multiple murders and received a life sentence. Christopher Gibson, another Aryan Brotherhood member, was convicted of conspiring with the others to commit the murders. The sentences imposed on these individuals marked a significant blow to the gang's leadership and would ultimately contribute to their decline. But even as the Aryan Brotherhood's power began to wane, its legacy continued to be felt. The gang's violent ideology and brutal tactics had inspired a new generation of white supremacist groups, both inside and outside of prison. As the Aryan Brotherhood's influence began to fade, other groups began to fill the power vacuum. The Aryan Circle, a rival prison gang, emerged as a significant force in the Texas prison system. The Aryan Circle had been formed in the 1980s, and it had a long and violent history with the Aryan Brotherhood. The two gangs had clashed numerous times over the years, and their conflict would continue even as the Aryan Brotherhood's power began to decline. But the Aryan Circle was not the only group to emerge in the aftermath of the Aryan Brotherhood's decline. Other white supremacist organizations, both inside and outside of prison, began to gain prominence, and they would carry on the legacy of violence and hatred that the Aryan Brotherhood had established. The Aryan Brotherhood's impact on the prison system and the wider community cannot be overstated. The gang's violent ideology and brutal tactics had inspired a generation of white supremacists, and their influence would be felt for years to come. But the Aryan Brotherhood's legacy is complex and multifaceted, and it cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of good versus evil. The gang's rise to power was facilitated by a combination of factors, including the desegregation of prisons, the dismantling of the building tender system, and the lack of effective leadership within the prison system. As the Aryan Brotherhood's power began to wane, it became clear that their decline was not just the result of law enforcement efforts, but also the result of a complex interplay of factors, including internal conflicts, leadership struggles, and the emergence of rival gangs. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the Aryan Brotherhood's influence began to decline, some of its members began to cooperate with law enforcement, providing valuable intelligence and testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. This development marked a significant shift in the gang's dynamics, as some members began to prioritize their own self-interest over their loyalty to the organization. The cooperation of these members would ultimately contribute to the downfall of the Aryan Brotherhood's leadership, and it would mark a significant turning point in the government's efforts to dismantle the gang. As the Aryan Brotherhood's power continued to wane, it became clear that their legacy would be one of violence, hatred, and ultimately, decline. But the story of the Aryan Brotherhood is far from over, and its impact will continue to be felt for years to come. As the Aryan Brotherhood's grip on the prison system began to loosen, its members were faced with a harsh reality. Their violent and racist ideology was no longer tolerated, and their power was waning. But that wasn't the end of the story, as the gang's legacy continued to inspire new generations of white supremacists. In fact, the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, a separate and distinct entity from the original Aryan Brotherhood, was still wreaking havoc in the Texas prison system. With its own brand of violent white supremacy, the ABT was responsible for numerous murders and other violent crimes, and its influence extended far beyond the prison walls. The ABT's rise to power was marked by brutal violence, including the infamous murder of Calvin Massey, a prospective member who was stabbed 42 times for violating the gang's constitution. This brutal attack was caught on camera, and the video clip helped prosecutors convict the perpetrator, Virgil Barfield, of murder. But despite such high-profile convictions, the ABT continued to thrive, thanks in part to its ability to adapt and evolve in response to changing circumstances. For example, when the gang was at war with the Mandingo Warriors, a black prison gang, they were able to exploit the weaknesses of their opponents and emerge victorious. But the ABT's success was not without its challenges, and the gang faced numerous threats from rival gangs and law enforcement. In fact, the ABT was engaged in a series of bloody wars with other gangs, including the Aryan Circle, which lasted for nearly a decade. During this time, the ABT was forced to navigate a complex web of alliances and rivalries, all while maintaining its grip on power. And yet, despite these challenges, the ABT remained one of the most feared and respected gangs in the Texas prison system. Meanwhile, the original Aryan Brotherhood was facing its own set of challenges, as the gang's leadership was being dismantled by law enforcement. Barry Mills, the notorious leader of the Aryan Brotherhood, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, along with his accomplice, Tyler Bingham. But even as the gang's leaders were being taken down, the Aryan Brotherhood's ideology continued to inspire new generations of white supremacists. In fact, the gang's influence extended far beyond the prison walls, with many of its members going on to commit violent crimes in the outside world. As the Aryan Brotherhood's power continued to wane, it became clear that the gang's legacy would be one of violence, hatred, and ultimately, decline. But the story of the Aryan Brotherhood is far from over, and its impact will continue to be felt for years to come. In fact, the gang's influence can still be seen in the numerous white supremacist groups that have sprung up in its wake. And as law enforcement continues to grapple with the threat posed by these groups, one thing is clear. The Aryan Brotherhood may be down, but it is far from out. But what happens next is anyone's guess, as the complex and often hidden world of white supremacist gangs continues to evolve and adapt in response to changing circumstances. Will the Aryan Brotherhood's legacy continue to inspire new generations of white supremacists, or will the gang's ideology eventually fade away? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain. The story of the Aryan Brotherhood is a stark reminder of the dangers of hate and extremism and the importance of vigilance in the face of such threats. And as we look to the future, we are left with a haunting question. What other secrets is the Aryan Brotherhood hiding, and how will they be revealed? As we delve deeper into the world of the Aryan Brotherhood, it becomes increasingly clear that their influence extends far beyond the prison walls. With a network of loyal members and associates on the outside, they have been able to coordinate complex operations, from drug trafficking to violent attacks on rival gangs and law enforcement. But what's even more disturbing is the level of sophistication they've achieved in their communication methods, using coded messages, encrypted phones, and even makeshift computers crafted from everyday prison items. This level of ingenuity has allowed them to stay one step ahead of their captors, at least for a time. But that wasn't the only indication of their growing power. The Aryan Brotherhood's ability to infiltrate and recruit from other gangs, as well as from the ranks of disillusioned whites, both in and out of prison, has been a key factor in their expansion. They prey on vulnerabilities, promising protection, a sense of belonging, and a cause to fight for, which can be particularly appealing to those feeling disenfranchised or marginalized. This strategy has allowed them to spread their ideology and increase their numbers, making them a more formidable force. However, the more they grow, the more they attract the attention of law enforcement and other gangs, setting the stage for a dangerous game of cat and mouse. The FBI, recognizing the threat posed by the Aryan Brotherhood, has dedicated significant resources to dismantling the organization. Through a combination of undercover operations, wiretaps, and informants, they have managed to gather crucial intelligence on the gang's leadership, operations, and plans. Yet, despite these efforts, the Aryan Brotherhood continues to adapt, often using the very tactics law enforcement employs against them. They have been known to feed misinformation to undercover agents, creating decoy operations to distract from their real activities. This cat-and-mouse game has led to a series of high-profile arrests and convictions, But the question remains: how much of the organization's upper echelon has truly been dismantled? One of the most intriguing aspects of the Aryan Brotherhood's resilience is their ability to evolve, to change their strategy in response to external pressures. For instance, as law enforcement crack down on their traditional methods of communication, they turn to more modern and secure forms of messaging, leveraging the anonymity of the dark web and encrypted communication apps. But this shift towards more technological means of operation has also introduced new vulnerabilities, as the digital trail can be easier to follow for those who know where to look. The race between the Aryan Brotherhood's efforts to stay hidden and law enforcement's efforts to uncover them has become increasingly complex, with each side continually adapting to the other's moves. But the story of the Aryan Brotherhood isn't just one of crime and violence. It's also a story of ideology, of a twisted worldview that emphasizes racial purity and supremacy. At its core, the Aryan Brotherhood is driven by a belief in the superiority of the white race and a desire to protect and advance the interests of whites, often through violent means. This ideology is not only morally reprehensible, but also deeply flawed, ignoring the complexity and diversity of human society. As we examine the roots of this ideology, we find a tangled web of influences, from Nazi philosophy to American white supremacist movements, all contributing to a dangerous and divisive worldview. The legal system has had a mixed record in dealing with the Aryan Brotherhood. On one hand, high-profile convictions have dealt significant blows to the organization, removing key leaders and disrupting their operations. On the other hand, the sheer resilience of the gang, its ability to regroup and continue operating, raises questions about the effectiveness of current strategies. There's a growing recognition of the need for a more nuanced approach, one that addresses not just the symptoms, but the underlying causes of gang involvement and extremist ideology. This includes rehabilitation programs, community outreach, and efforts to counter hate speech and propaganda, all aimed at preventing the spread of the Aryan Brotherhood's influence. As investigations into the Aryan Brotherhood continue, new details emerge that paint a picture of an organization both brutal and calculating. The use of violence as a tool for discipline and control is well documented, with members often being forced to participate in beatings or murders as a form of initiation or loyalty test. But what's less well known is the psychological manipulation that also occurs, with leaders playing on members' fears and insecurities to maintain control. This complex interplay of physical and psychological coercion helps to explain why leaving the gang is so difficult and why the threat it poses extends far beyond the prison system. The Aryan Brotherhood's impact on the broader white supremacist movement is another area of concern. As one of the most prominent and violent white supremacist groups, they have become a symbol of resistance and a beacon for like-minded individuals. Their ideology, though repugnant, has found fertile ground in certain segments of society, contributing to a surge in hate crimes and extremist activity. The challenge for law enforcement and community leaders is to address these underlying issues, to find ways to counter the narrative of hate and supremacy with one of inclusivity and respect. It's a daunting task, but one that's essential to preventing the spread of the Aryan Brotherhood's toxic ideology. But that's not the only challenge. The Aryan Brotherhood's influence can also be seen in the political arena, where their ideology has, in some cases, intersected with more mainstream political movements. The blurring of lines between extremist groups and political activism has raised alarms, as it suggests a normalization of hate speech and a dangerous erosion of civil discourse. The implications are profound, suggesting that the fight against the Aryan Brotherhood and similar groups is not just a law enforcement issue, but a societal one, requiring a collective effort to reject extremism and promote tolerance. As the battle against the Aryan Brotherhood continues, it's clear that no single strategy will suffice. A combination of law enforcement action, community engagement, and political will is needed to dismantle the organization and counter its ideology. But even as we move forward with these efforts, there's a nagging sense that we're only scratching the surface, that there are more secrets waiting to be uncovered, more surprises in store. The Aryan Brotherhood's history is marked by unexpected twists and turns, and there's every reason to believe that their future will be just as unpredictable. The question, then, is not if they will evolve again, but how, and what the consequences of that evolution will be. In the end, the story of the Aryan Brotherhood serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred and the importance of vigilance. It's a story that's both disturbing and enlightening, offering insights into the darkest corners of human nature and the complexities of combating extremism. As we reflect on the lessons learned from this saga, we're left with a daunting realization. The fight against hate and supremacy is ongoing, and it requires the active participation of us all. The future of this fight is uncertain, filled with challenges and unknowns, but one thing is clear. The stakes are high, and the outcome will depend on our collective resolve to stand against extremism in all its forms. As we delve deeper into the complexities of the Aryan Brotherhood, it becomes increasingly clear that the group's influence extends far beyond the prison walls. With a sophisticated network of loyal members and associates, the AB has managed to infiltrate various aspects of American society, from law enforcement to local politics. One of the most alarming aspects of this infiltration is the group's ability to recruit and manipulate individuals in positions of power, often using tactics of intimidation and coercion to further their own interests. But what's even more disturbing is the fact that some of these individuals have been able to fly under the radar, hiding in plain sight as they carry out the AB's nefarious agenda. The question remains, how many more are out there, and what's the full extent of their reach? The Aryan Brotherhood's rise to power can be attributed, in part, to the charismatic leadership of figures like Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham, who were able to unite various factions under a single banner. However, as the group's influence grew, so did the internal power struggles and conflicts. It's been reported that Mills, in particular, was known for his ruthless tactics, using violence and intimidation to maintain control and discipline within the organization. But despite these internal struggles, the AB was able to present a unified front, at least publicly, and this facade of unity was a key factor in their ability to expand and consolidate power. But that wasn't the only factor at play. As we'll see, the group's ability to adapt and evolve in response to changing circumstances was also crucial to their success. One of the most significant challenges faced by law enforcement in their efforts to combat the Aryan Brotherhood was the group's ability to use the prison system to their advantage. By infiltrating the corrections system and recruiting new members from the inmate population, the AB was able to create a self-sustaining cycle of recruitment and expansion. This cycle was further fueled by the group's ability to provide protection and support to their members, both inside and outside of prison. But what's particularly noteworthy is the fact that the AB was able to achieve this level of influence without necessarily being the largest or most prominent prison gang. Instead, they relied on a combination of strategic alliances, cunning, and ruthless determination to achieve their goals. And as we'll see, this ability to operate under the radar, to fly beneath the notice of their enemies, was a key factor in their success. As the Aryan Brotherhood continued to grow and expand, they began to attract the attention of other white supremacist groups and organizations. Some of these groups, like the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi lowriders, were drawn to the AB's ideology and saw them as a potential ally in their own struggles. However, others were more wary, viewing the AB as a threat to their own power and influence. This led to a complex web of alliances and rivalries, with different groups vying for position and power within the broader white supremacist movement. But what's interesting is that, despite these tensions, the AB was able to maintain a level of autonomy and independence, refusing to be drawn into the orbit of any one particular group or ideology. And this independence, this ability to chart their own course, was a key factor in their ability to survive and thrive in a rapidly changing environment. The Aryan Brotherhood's involvement in the broader white supremacist movement also raises important questions about the nature of hate and extremism in America. While the AB's ideology is undoubtedly rooted in racism and bigotry, it's also clear that their appeal extends beyond these factors. For some, the group's emphasis on loyalty, discipline, and self-reliance may be seen as a twisted form of patriotism or nationalism. Others may be drawn to the AB's anti-authoritarian stance, seeing them as a rebellious force against an oppressive system. But what's crucial to recognize is that these factors, while they may be appealing to some, are ultimately rooted in a deeply flawed and misguided ideology. And it's this ideology, with its emphasis on hate and supremacy, that must be confronted and challenged if we're to have any hope of creating a more just and equitable society. As we continue to explore the complex and often disturbing world of the Aryan Brotherhood, it's becoming increasingly clear that the group's influence extends far beyond the prison system. With tentacles reaching into local communities, law enforcement, and even the military, the AB's reach is both broader and more insidious than previously thought. And while it's true that the group has faced significant setbacks and challenges in recent years, including the conviction of key leaders and the disruption of their internal hierarchy, it's also clear that they remain a potent and resilient force. But what's the most worrying aspect of all this is the fact that, despite the progress that's been made, the underlying conditions that gave rise to the AB in the first place remain largely unchanged. The poverty, the inequality, the sense of disenfranchisement and disillusionment that drives individuals to seek out extremist ideologies, all of these factors remain, waiting to be exploited by the next generation of hate groups and extremists. The investigation into the Aryan Brotherhood has also shed light on the group's sophisticated use of technology and social media to spread their ideology and recruit new members. Through online forums, social media platforms, and encrypted messaging apps, the AB has been able to reach a wider audience and create a sense of community and belonging among their followers. But what's even more alarming is the fact that these online platforms have also been used to disseminate hate speech, intimidate opponents, and even coordinate violent attacks. And as we'll see, the AB's use of technology has also created new challenges for law enforcement, who must now navigate the complex and ever-evolving landscape of online extremism. But that's not the only challenge they face, as the group's ability to adapt and evolve in response to changing circumstances has made them a formidable and elusive foe. As the Aryan Brotherhood continues to evolve and adapt, it's becoming increasingly clear that the group's ideology is not just a product of their prison origins, but also a reflection of the broader societal trends and attitudes that have given rise to their extremist views. The AB's emphasis on white supremacy, for example, is rooted in a long and troubling history of racism and bigotry in America. And while it's true that the group's ideology is extreme and reprehensible, it's also clear that they are not alone in their views. The question remains, how can we as a society work to address the underlying conditions that give rise to hate and extremism and create a more just and equitable world for all? But what's even more pressing is the fact that, as we speak, the Aryan Brotherhood and other extremist groups are continuing to recruit, organize, and plot, using every tool at their disposal to spread their hate and achieve their twisted goals. The Aryan Brotherhood's ability to infiltrate and manipulate the prison system has also had a profound impact on the lives of countless individuals and families. For those who have been directly affected by the group's violence and intimidation, the trauma and pain can be overwhelming. And for those who have lost loved ones to the AB's brutality, the grief and sense of loss can be devastating. But what's even more tragic is the fact that, despite the progress that's been made, many of these families and individuals continue to live in fear, unsure of when or if the AB will strike again. And as we'll see, the group's ability to inspire fear and loyalty in their followers has created a culture of silence and intimidation, making it difficult for those who have been affected to speak out or seek help. But that wasn't the only consequence of the AB's actions, as the group's violence and intimidation have also had a profound impact on the broader community, creating a sense of unease and mistrust that can be difficult to overcome. As we delve deeper into the world of the Aryan Brotherhood, it's becoming increasingly clear that the group's ideology is not just a product of their extremist views, but also a reflection of the broader societal trends and attitudes that have given rise to their hate. The AB's emphasis on white supremacy, for example, is rooted in a long and troubling history of racism and bigotry in America. And while it's true that the group's ideology is extreme and reprehensible, it's also clear that they are not alone in their views. The question remains, how can we as a society work to address the underlying conditions that give rise to hate and extremism and create a more just and equitable world for all? But what's even more pressing is the fact that, as we speak, the Aryan Brotherhood and other extremist groups are continuing to recruit, organize, and plot, using every tool at their disposal to spread their hate and achieve their twisted goals. And as we'll see, the consequences of inaction could be catastrophic, as the AB and other extremist groups continue to push the boundaries of hate and violence, threatening the very fabric of our society. The Aryan Brotherhood's use of violence and intimidation has also had a profound impact on the lives of those who have been directly affected by their actions. For those who have been targeted by the group, the experience can be traumatic and devastating. And for those who have lost loved ones to the AB's brutality, the grief and sense of loss can be overwhelming. But what's even more tragic is the fact that, despite the progress that's been made, many of these families and individuals continue to live in fear, unsure of when or if the AB will strike again. And as we'll see, the group's ability to inspire fear and loyalty in their followers has created a culture of silence and intimidation, making it difficult for those who have been affected to speak out or seek help. But that's not the only consequence of the AB's actions, as the group's violence and intimidation have also had a profound impact on the broader community, creating a sense of unease and mistrust that can be difficult to overcome. And as we continue to explore the complex and often disturbing world of the Aryan Brotherhood, it's becoming increasingly clear that the group's influence extends far beyond the prison system, and that their ideology is not just a product of their extremist views, but also a reflection of the broader societal trends and attitudes that have given rise to their hate. As the investigation into the Aryan Brotherhood continues, it's becoming increasingly clear that the group's ideology is not just a product of their prison origins, but also a reflection of the broader societal trends and attitudes that have given rise to their extremist views. The AB's emphasis on white supremacy, for example, is rooted in a long and troubling history of racism and bigotry in America. And while it's true that the group's ideology is extreme and reprehensible, it's also clear that they are not alone in their views. The question remains, how can we as a society work to address the underlying conditions that give rise to hate and extremism and create a more just and equitable world for all? But what's even more pressing is the fact that, as we speak, the Aryan Brotherhood and other extremist groups are continuing to recruit, organize, and plot, using every tool at their disposal to spread their hate and achieve their twisted goals. And as we'll see, the consequences of inaction could be catastrophic, as the AB and other extremist groups continue to push the boundaries of hate and violence, threatening the very fabric of our society. But that's not the only challenge we face, as the group's ability to adapt and evolve in response to changing circumstances has made them a formidable and elusive foe. The Aryan Brotherhood's ability to infiltrate and manipulate the prison system has also had a profound impact on the lives of countless individuals and families. For those who have been directly affected by the group's violence and intimidation, the trauma and pain can be overwhelming. And for those who have lost loved ones to the AB's brutality, the grief and sense of loss can be devastating. But what's even more tragic is the fact that, despite the progress that's been made, many of these families and individuals continue to live in fear, unsure of when or if the AB will strike again. And as we'll see, the group's ability to inspire fear and loyalty in their followers has created a culture of silence and intimidation, making it difficult for those who have been affected to speak out or seek help. But that's not the only consequence of the AB's actions, as the group's violence and intimidation have also had a profound impact on the broader community, creating a sense of unease and mistrust that can be difficult to overcome. And as we continue to explore the complex and often disturbing world of the Aryan Brotherhood, it's becoming increasingly clear that the group's influence extends far beyond the prison system, and that their ideology is not just a product of their extremist views, but also a reflection of the broader societal trends and attitudes that have given rise to their hate. As we delve deeper into the world of the Aryan Brotherhood, it's becoming increasingly clear that the group's ideology is not just a product of their extremist views, but also a reflection of the broader societal trends and attitudes that have given rise to their hate. The AB's emphasis on white supremacy, for example, is rooted in a long and troubling history of racism and bigotry in America. And while it's true that the group's ideology is extreme and reprehensible, it's also clear that they are not alone in their views. The question remains, how can we as a society work to address the underlying conditions that give rise to hate and extremism and create a more just and equitable world for all? But what's even more pressing is the fact that, as we speak, the Aryan Brotherhood and other extremist groups are continuing to recruit, organize, and plot, using every tool at their disposal to spread their hate and achieve their twisted goals. And as we'll see, the consequences of inaction could be catastrophic, as the AB and other extremist groups continue to push the boundaries of hate and violence, threatening the very fabric of our society. But that's not the only challenge we face, as the group's ability to adapt and evolve in response to changing circumstances has made them a formidable and elusive foe. And as we'll see, the investigation into the Aryan Brotherhood is far from over, as new evidence and new leads continue to emerge, shedding light on the group. As the Aryan Brotherhood continued to expand its reach, both within and outside the prison system, law enforcement agencies found themselves facing a complex and multifaceted threat. One of the key challenges in taking down the group was its ability to blend in with other white supremacist organizations, making it difficult to discern who was a member and who was simply a sympathizer. This blurred line between affiliation and membership allowed the Aryan Brotherhood to maintain a level of plausible deniability, making it harder for investigators to gather concrete evidence. But that wasn't the only obstacle, as the group's own internal hierarchy and code of conduct added an additional layer of complexity to the investigation. The Aryan Brotherhood's strict code of conduct, which emphasized loyalty and silence above all else, made it extremely difficult for members to cooperate with authorities. Those who did choose to cooperate often faced severe reprisals, including violence and even death. This culture of fear and intimidation extended beyond the prison walls, as the group's members and associates on the outside were also subject to the same code of conduct. But despite these challenges, investigators were able to make some significant breakthroughs, including the discovery of a hidden network of communication channels used by the group to coordinate their activities. And as they delved deeper into the world of the Aryan Brotherhood, they began to uncover some surprising contradictions. One of the most striking aspects of the Aryan Brotherhood was its ability to present itself as a bastion of white supremacist ideology, while at the same time engaging in activities that were decidedly unideological. For example, the group was heavily involved in the methamphetamine trade, which not only generated significant profits, but also helped to fuel the very social problems that the group claimed to be fighting against. This paradox raised important questions about the true nature of the Aryan Brotherhood's ideology and whether it was simply a convenient cover for more mundane criminal activities. But that wasn't the strangest part, as investigators soon discovered that the group's involvement in the meth trade was just the tip of the iceberg. As the investigation continued to unfold, it became clear that the Aryan Brotherhood was involved in a wide range of criminal activities, from extortion and robbery to murder and assault. The group's members were also known to have ties to other organized crime groups, including motorcycle gangs and even some law enforcement officials. This web of connections and alliances added a new level of complexity to the investigation, as it became clear that the Aryan Brotherhood was not just a standalone organization, but rather a key player in a much larger ecosystem of crime and corruption. And as investigators worked to untangle this complex web, they began to uncover some disturbing patterns and trends. One of the most alarming aspects of the Aryan Brotherhood's activities was its apparent ability to infiltrate and manipulate the very institutions that were supposed to be working against it. For example, there were reports of group members and associates working as prison guards, police officers, and even prosecutors, allowing them to gather intelligence and influence the outcome of cases. This level of penetration raised serious questions about the integrity of the justice system and whether it was truly equipped to deal with the threat posed by the Aryan Brotherhood. But as investigators dug deeper, they began to realize that the group's influence extended far beyond the walls of the prison or the courtroom. The Aryan Brotherhood's reach into the broader community was a major concern, as the group's ideology and activities had the potential to inspire and radicalize others. The group's propaganda efforts, which included everything from racist literature to white power music, were designed to spread its message and attract new recruits. And as the investigation continued, it became clear that the group's efforts were having a significant impact, with a growing number of young people and others being drawn into the world of white supremacy. But what was even more disturbing was the fact that the Aryan Brotherhood's ideology was not just limited to the fringe elements of society, as many of its ideas and attitudes were being mainstreamed and legitimized by more respectable sources. As the Aryan Brotherhood's influence continued to spread, investigators began to realize that the group's ideology was not just a product of its own internal dynamics, but was also being shaped by broader social and cultural trends. The group's emphasis on white identity and its perceived grievances against the system resonated with many people who felt disenfranchised and disillusioned with the status quo. And as the investigation delved deeper into the world of the Aryan Brotherhood, it became clear that the group's ideology was not just a marginal phenomenon, but was rather a symptom of a much deeper and more complex set of social and cultural issues. But that wasn't the only factor at play, as the group's own internal dynamics and power struggles were also playing a significant role in shaping its ideology and activities. The Aryan Brotherhood's internal hierarchy was a complex and often brutal system, with members competing for power and status within the organization. This competition often turned violent as members clashed with each other over issues of loyalty, territory, and resources. And as investigators worked to understand the group's internal dynamics, they began to realize that the Aryan Brotherhood was not just a monolithic organization, but was rather a collection of competing factions and interests. But what was even more surprising was the fact that the group's internal power struggles were not just limited to its own members, as outside forces were also playing a significant role in shaping the group's trajectory. The Aryan Brotherhood's relationship with other organized crime groups was a key factor in its success and survival, as the group was able to form alliances and partnerships that helped to expand its reach and influence. But these relationships were not without their risks, as the group's involvement with other organizations often brought it into conflict with rival factions and interests. And as investigators worked to untangle the complex web of alliances and rivalries, they began to realize that the Aryan Brotherhood was not just a standalone organization, but was rather a key player in a much larger ecosystem of crime and corruption. But that wasn't the only challenge, as the group's own internal contradictions and paradoxes were also posing a significant threat to its stability and survival. One of the most significant challenges facing the Aryan Brotherhood was its own internal contradiction between ideology and practice. On the one hand, the group presented itself as a bastion of white supremacist ideology, committed to the principles of racial purity and separation. But on the other hand, the group's involvement in the methamphetamine trade and other criminal activities often brought it into contact with people and groups that were decidedly non-white. This paradox raised important questions about the true nature of the Aryan Brotherhood's ideology and whether it was simply a convenient cover for more mundane criminal activities. But as investigators delved deeper into the world of the group, they began to realize that the Aryan Brotherhood's ideology was not just a fixed or static entity, but was rather a dynamic and evolving system that was shaped by a complex array of factors and influences. The Aryan Brotherhood's ideology was a complex and multifaceted system that drew on a wide range of sources and influences, from white supremacist literature to heavy metal music. The group's members were known to be avid readers of racist and anti-Semitic literature, and many were also involved in the white power music scene. But as investigators worked to understand the group's ideology, they began to realize that it was not just a product of external influences, but was also shaped by the group's own internal dynamics and experiences. And as they delved deeper into the world of the Aryan Brotherhood, they began to uncover some surprising insights into the group's motivations and attitudes. One of the most surprising aspects of the Aryan Brotherhood was its ability to inspire a sense of community and belonging among its members. Despite the group's violent and often brutal nature, many of its members reported feeling a strong sense of loyalty and camaraderie with their fellow members. This sense of community was often rooted in the group's shared experiences and struggles, as well as its collective sense of purpose and identity. But as investigators worked to understand the group's dynamics, they began to realize that this sense of community was not just a positive force, but was also a key factor in the group's ability to recruit and retain members. And as they delved deeper into the world of the Aryan Brotherhood, they began to uncover some disturbing patterns and trends. The Aryan Brotherhood's recruitment efforts were a major concern, as the group's ability to attract new members and sympathizers was a key factor in its survival and growth. The group's propaganda efforts, which included everything from racist literature to white power music, were designed to spread its message and attract new recruits. And as investigators worked to understand the group's recruitment strategies, they began to realize that the Aryan Brotherhood was not just targeting vulnerable and disenfranchised individuals, but was also actively seeking to infiltrate and manipulate mainstream institutions and organizations. But what was even more disturbing was the fact that the group's ideology was not just limited to the fringe elements of society, as many of its ideas and attitudes were being mainstreamed and legitimized by more respectable sources. As the investigation into the Aryan Brotherhood continued to unfold, it became clear that the group's impact and influence extended far beyond the world of organized crime. The group's ideology and activities were having a profound impact on the broader community, inspiring a new generation of white supremacists and fueling a growing sense of polarization and division. And as investigators worked to understand the group's dynamics and motivations, they began to realize that the Aryan Brotherhood was not just a marginal phenomenon, but was rather a symptom of a much deeper and more complex set of social and cultural issues. But that wasn't the only factor at play, as the group's own internal contradictions and paradoxes were also posing a significant threat to its stability and survival. The Aryan Brotherhood's internal power struggles were a major concern, as the group's competing factions and interests were often at odds with each other. This competition often turned violent, as members clashed with each other over issues of loyalty, territory, and resources. And as investigators worked to understand the group's internal dynamics, they began to realize that the Aryan Brotherhood was not just a monolithic organization, but was rather a collection of competing factions and interests. But what was even more surprising was the fact that the group's internal power struggles were not just limited to its own members, as outside forces were also playing a significant role in shaping the group's trajectory. As the Aryan Brotherhood story continued to unfold, it became clear that the group's impact and influence would be felt for years to come. The group's ideology and activities had inspired a new generation of white supremacists, and its legacy would continue to shape the world of organized crime and extremism. And as investigators worked to bring the group's members to justice, they began to realize that the Aryan Brotherhood was not just a criminal organization, but was rather a symptom of a much deeper and more complex set of social and cultural issues. But that wasn't the only challenge, as the group's own internal contradictions and paradoxes were also posing a significant threat to its stability and survival. And as the investigation continued to unfold, it became clear that the Aryan Brotherhood story was far from over, as new evidence and new leads continued to emerge, shedding light on the group's activities and motivations. But that wasn't the strangest part, as the group's legacy would continue to shape the world of organized crime and extremism for years to come. The Aryan Brotherhood's influence extended far beyond the prison walls, with members and associates operating on the outside, orchestrating crimes and violence that would further the group's agenda. As investigators delved deeper, they discovered a complex web of connections between the Aryan Brotherhood and other white supremacist organizations, highlighting the group's role in the broader extremist landscape. But what was particularly alarming was the way the Aryan Brotherhood seemed to be evolving, adapting to changing circumstances and exploiting new opportunities for growth and expansion. This was evident in the group's increasing involvement in the methamphetamine trade, which not only generated significant profits, but also helped to solidify the Aryan Brotherhood's position within the wider world of organized crime. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the Aryan Brotherhood's leadership was not as unified as it seemed, with different factions and personalities vying for power and influence. This internal strife would ultimately prove to be a major weakness, as law enforcement was able to exploit these divisions and turn members against each other. But despite these internal conflicts, the Aryan Brotherhood remained a formidable force, with a strong sense of loyalty and camaraderie among its members. This was reflected in the group's elaborate system of codes, rituals, and initiation ceremonies, which served to bind members together and reinforce their commitment to the Aryan Brotherhood's ideology. Yet, as investigators looked closer, they began to uncover evidence of a more sinister purpose behind these rituals, one that was deeply rooted in the group's white supremacist ideology. One of the most significant challenges facing law enforcement was the Aryan Brotherhood's ability to operate with relative impunity, using its network of members and associates to gather intelligence and stay one step ahead of its enemies. This was particularly evident in the group's use of cryptic messages and coded communications, which allowed members to convey sensitive information without being detected. But as investigators gained a deeper understanding of the Aryan Brotherhood's communication protocols, they began to crack the code, uncovering a wealth of information about the group's plans and operations. This, in turn, led to a series of high-profile arrests and convictions, which would ultimately deal a significant blow to the Aryan Brotherhood's leadership and disrupt its operations. However, the group's resilience and adaptability would soon become apparent as it began to regroup and reorganize in the face of these setbacks. The Aryan Brotherhood's relationship with other prison gangs was also a key area of focus for investigators, as they sought to understand the complex web of alliances and rivalries that existed within the prison system. This was particularly important, given the group's history of violence and conflict with other gangs, which had often spilled over into the wider community. As investigators looked closer, they discovered that the Aryan Brotherhood had formed strategic alliances with certain gangs while maintaining a fierce rivalry with others. This delicate balance of power would ultimately prove to be a major factor in the group's downfall, as law enforcement was able to exploit these tensions and turn the gangs against each other. But what was perhaps most surprising was the way in which the Aryan Brotherhood had managed to infiltrate and manipulate the prison system, using its members and associates to gather intelligence and exert influence from within. As the years passed, the Aryan Brotherhood's legacy would continue to shape the world of organized crime and extremism, with the group's ideology and tactics being adopted by other white supremacist organizations. This was evident in the rise of new extremist groups, which often modeled themselves on the Aryan Brotherhood's structure and ideology. But what was perhaps most disturbing was the way in which the Aryan Brotherhood's influence had seeped into the mainstream, with its ideology and symbolism being co-opted by certain elements of the far right. This, in turn, had helped to fuel a surge in hate crimes and extremist violence, which would have far-reaching consequences for communities across the United States. As investigators reflected on the Aryan Brotherhood's history and impact, they couldn't help but wonder what the future held for this notorious group, and whether its legacy would continue to inspire violence and extremism for years to come. The Aryan Brotherhood story is also a testament to the complexities and challenges of combating organized crime and extremism, particularly in the prison system. As investigators and law enforcement officials worked to disrupt the group's operations and bring its members to justice, they were often confronted with difficult choices and moral dilemmas. This was particularly evident in the use of informants and cooperating witnesses, who often had their own motivations and agendas. As the investigation continued, it became clear that some of these informants had been deeply embedded within the Aryan Brotherhood, providing valuable intelligence to law enforcement while also pursuing their own interests. But what was perhaps most surprising was the way in which these informants had managed to manipulate the system, using their position to further their own goals and agendas. This would ultimately raise important questions about the use of informants in law enforcement and the potential risks and consequences of relying on these individuals to gather intelligence and build cases. As the Aryan Brotherhood story continues to unfold, it is clear that the group's impact will be felt for years to come, both within the prison system and beyond. The group's legacy serves as a reminder of the dangers of extremism and the importance of addressing the root causes of violence and hatred. But it also highlights the complexities and challenges of combating organized crime, particularly in the prison system, where the lines between good and evil are often blurred. As investigators and law enforcement officials look to the future, they must confront the reality of the Aryan Brotherhood's enduring influence and the ongoing threat that it poses to communities across the United States. This will require a sustained and coordinated effort, one that involves not only law enforcement, but also community leaders, policymakers, and other stakeholders. Only by working together can we hope to mitigate the Aryan Brotherhood's impact and build a safer, more just society for all. The Aryan Brotherhood's history is also a reminder of the importance of understanding the complexities of the prison system and the ways in which it can both reflect and reinforce societal problems. The group's rise to prominence was, in many ways, a symptom of broader issues, including poverty, racism, and social inequality. As we move forward, it is essential that we address these underlying issues and work to create a more just and equitable society. This will require a fundamental transformation of the prison system, one that prioritizes rehabilitation and restorative justice over punishment and retribution. It will also require a sustained commitment to community development and social investment, as we work to build stronger, more resilient communities that are better equipped to resist the allure of extremism and violence. By taking a comprehensive and nuanced approach, we can hope to reduce the Aryan Brotherhood's influence and build a brighter future.